Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski, and I wanted to create a video in which I would kind of talk about It Can't Happen Here, right? Because we at long last get to start reading Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. I have to tell you that I've loved what I've read so far. The information that you found out about Sinclair Lewis was fantastic. Some of the thesis statements that students have created have been really interesting and really strong. So before we got into, kind of reading about It Can't Happen Here, I just wanted to talk briefly, give you some thoughts, my thoughts on the novel. It's probably pretty clear that if I were to create a thesis statement, I would argue something about Lewis. I have many arguments. First, I would argue that he's the most influential writer of the 1920s. I love that because, that puts him ahead of Faulkner. It puts him ahead of The Great Gatsby and F. Scott Fitzgerald. It puts him in front of Hemingway. And really, you could argue that he was the conscience of the 1920s. But we also know that Lewis did something more, right? Because Lewis transcended, right, in the 1920s. Here we're looking at a book that deals with the 1930s with Sinclair Lewis as well. I'd argue that what Sinclair Lewis did was that, he paved the way for pop culture and future generations for the rest half of the 20th century. So in essence, what, he created basically the basis for what defines a man. He opens up the door for Tennessee Williams, Streetcar Named Desire, Arthur Miller, Death of a Salesman, John Updike, Philip Roth, right? He's really paving the way for episodes of The Simpsons. So in some sense, really what Sinclair Lewis was really known as a satirist, right? He was making a satire on American culture and American society. So when we transition, though, and we get to look at It Can't Happen Here, right, where Sinclair Lewis creates an imaginary world where a dictatorship basically established itself in the 1930s. It's an interesting premise. My argument also with Lewis is that Lewis paved the way for George Orwell in 1984, that by writing It Can't Happen Here is really the precursor for when Orwell will write 1984. So obviously I think Lewis is pretty influential. As we get into looking at Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, though, I want you to think a couple things. I want to think about, how serious was Lewis in the belief that actually a dictatorship could establish itself in America? Is he taking this idea seriously? And the novel did get some popularity in the last, give or take, 10 years, maybe we could say 6 years, with the election of Trump. There's some people that argue that Lewis was really, had predicted the rise of Donald Trump before Donald Trump became president. So take that for what it's worth. I wonder if Lewis is really arguing that innate within the American character and the American psyche, we have this innate fear of authoritarianism. We have this innate fear that a dictator will take over. And if you think that's sort of the base of the foundation of our country, right? We rebelled against the King of England, right? But in America's character, how much of that is innate in our character and how much of it is satire? Because if you want to go back and you look at sort of the, contemporary history, right? When Ronald Reagan was president, people were arguing he's just like Hitler, right? When Bill Clinton was president, there was no doubt he was Hitler, right? George W. Bush was definitely Hitler. Obama was just the black Hitler. But, the rhetoric that we've always seen is that everyone says, our politicians are dictators, they're fascists. So I wonder if Lewis is arguing that, that is just innate in the American character, or is it a satire? I want you to also think how much of this book is a satire, because the main character's name is DeMaurice Jessup. What kind of name is that for a protagonist? The guy running for president is named President Windrip. Who the hell is going to elect someone to become president with that kind of a name, right? So was he taking this argument seriously, or was he creating a satire, is kind of an interesting question to kind of raise. Also a great way to look at kind of rhetoric and ask, why would the country, based on President Windrip's rhetoric, vote for such a person? But these are things to kind of think about as you're kind of going through the novel. The quiz for this week is really easy. If you read, you really won't have any problem. I'm much more interested in thinking some of your thoughts and ideas on the book. The paper that you're going to write is pretty straightforward, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to write a bio on Sinclair Lewis, right? I want you to have a hook, make me want to read your paper, in with some kind of bold thesis, and then have a bio that kind of talks about Sinclair Lewis. And then what we'll do in a couple of weeks is we'll add a paper topic for It Can't Happen Here. As is the case, if you need anything, email me. But otherwise, I'm looking forward to see what you write this week.